One of the really interesting things about the Hebrew Scriptures, as opposed to the New Testament, is that they are written over a very long period of time. And because of that, you get to watch the development of different ideas take shape over the course of the different books that are written and compiled together. And one of the really interesting little glimpses we get into the Hebrew development of the idea of God in the earth happens in Genesis 18. And it's this really neat story where Abraham and his wife Sarah are visited by Yahweh, and Yahweh appears as these three men. But this story sits in between an earlier conception of God in the divine council, with a lot of lowercase gods that God interacts with, and a later conception of the angel of the Lord who represents God in the earth. This story kind of serves as a bit of a transition point, and as that, it's a really fascinating glimpse into the ongoing developmental practice of understanding God in the world. Now, I think one of the corollary benefits of exploring a story like this in the Hebrew Scriptures is that it opens us up to realize that we are still, in some sense, trying to make sense of the divine. And that is the beauty of what it means to call ourselves people of faith. So let's take a look here quickly at Genesis 18 and the development of God. Next verse we read that Abraham looked up and saw three men standing nearby. When he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed low to the ground. He said, "If I found favor in your eyes, my Lord, do not pass your servant by." Note here, Abraham switches to using a singular pronoun. "Let a little water be brought, that you may all wash your feet and rest under the tree." We're back to plural pronouns here. "Let me get you something to eat so that you can be refreshed, then go on your way, now that you've come to your servant." "Very well," they answered. "Do as you say." Now, we have a bit of a side quest here, because the big question when we read this is like, what's up with these three guys called Yahweh? Well, Christians often unsurprisingly see Trinity here. Three figures that, at least on the surface, are collectively called by the divine name. That must be Father, Son, and Spirit, and that's not an unreasonable conjecture at all. However, it's also like almost certainly not what the writer of this story had in mind at all. In fact, the most straightforward way to read the Hebrew here is that Abraham addresses one of the figures as Lord, and then switches to plural pronouns when he invites them all just to stay for lunch. And that actually makes a lot of sense of the earliest Hebrew conceptions of Yahweh, where God is often talked about surrounded by the divine council. So at the start of Genesis, God talks about creating humans in our image. That's not a plural God. That is God addressing the divine council. Now, it's God who's doing the creating, but God is explaining God's plan to this group of, we can call them lowercase gods that accompany God in the heavens. And you can see this idea, for example, in Psalm 82, when the poet writes, God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. Now, over time, concepts of God evolve throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, and the divine council idea kind of falls away as monotheism becomes a central pillar for the Hebrew people. And so in later stories, these lowercase gods, Elohim, start being referred to as angels, malach more commonly. But considering we're only in Genesis 18 here, and Abraham very directly refers to the divine name Yahweh, it's likely that this is some form of divine counsel being invoked in the story. These three men are Yahweh and Yahweh's entourage, sort of. Because the other complicating factor here is another idea that emerges a little later called the angel of the Lord. See, in Exodus, next book, we're going to be told that no one can see God and live. In fact, at one point, God is so desperate to show God's self to Moses that at one point, God decides to let Moses see God's hind parts, which disappointingly is not a reference to the divine derriere, but instead probably points to the place where God has just been. You can see that, Moses. Still, if that's the case, and seeing God means death, then, well, how does God show up here for lunch with our boy Abe?
And that's where the angel of the Lord comes in. Because in later Hebrew scriptures, when God wants to show up, we find this character called the angel of the Lord or the angel of Yahweh. And people will speak to this character as if it was Yahweh. This character will make pronouncements as if it was God, and yet people live. And the basic concept here is that the angel of the Lord is the personal, specific representative of Yahweh on the earth. And so this character speaks as God. This character carries the full authority of God. And that makes a lot of sense because even though we have a lot of speculative fan fiction about angels, the root of the Hebrew word malach simply means messenger. And in the ancient world, messengers often did carry the word of a king or a dignitary. That was their job. So if you, as a human, encounter the personal, specific messenger of God, then you are, for all intents and purposes, standing in the presence of that God. You are hearing directly from God. Thankfully, though, you get to walk away from the encounter. So it's also possible that this story here in Genesis 18 is one of the first conceptual appearances of the angel of the Lord, a concept that gets codified with specific language later in the Hebrew scriptures. So this is actually kind of a really neat, cool glimpse into the development of Hebrew thought about God. Kind of fun. Bottom line, though, is that this trio is a tangible representation of God on the earth. It's hard to get a little more specific than that.
Hey, thanks for watching through, clicking on that, and making it through to the end. If you're intrigued by the work that we do here at Commons, then by all means, subscribe to the channel here, give us a like, throw a comment down below. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to dive deeper into community, you can also join our Discord server, where we're cultivating conversations throughout the community about all the ways that we follow Jesus.